Once World War II came to a close, the Soviet Union and the United States lost their only common enemy, setting the Cold War into motion. One outlet for this tension was the space race, an informal competition between the two powers to get a satellite and then a man into space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, winning the first victory. Then, in April 1961, the Soviet Union succeeded in sending the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. From these defeats, the United States vowed to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, setting the foundations for NASA's lunar landing program, better known as Project Apollo, and successive projects.
Hello, my name is Frank Sutliff.
The Space Transportation System, STS, was a manned launch vehicle program that lasted 30 years. The shuttle itself was reusable and was composed of an orbiter, 2 solid rocket boosters, and an external tank. Although the program was successful in building the largest man-made structure in space, the International Space Station, it suffered many failures, such as the Challenger disaster.
The accident of the Challenger, which was the STS-51, exploded after 73 seconds of flight. It had launched and 7 astronauts lost their lives immediately upon the explosion. There was no suffering, it was very quick. I was working on, this is the payload doors, and inside the payload doors was the teacher's satellite. Attached to the teacher's satellite was a booster rocket, maybe the size of this little cone right there, and it was attached to the teacher's satellite. Its job was, when this shuttle released itself from this tank and these side rockets, and it was approximately 125, 115 miles, I forgot the exact number of miles, in orbit. These payload doors would open and the shuttle would deploy the teacher satellite with the IUS, which was what I was working with, and I was the program manager for the Air Force with it, and move away. And then it would ignite the IUS and push the teacher satellite 22,500 miles, 22,400 miles further. Then it would be in an orbit that it would be synchronous with the Earth. And this little rocket did a lot. It was pretty big at the time because it's all inside here. This took it up 100 miles. This took it up 22,500 it was.
The IUS, or Inertial Upper Space, was a booster rocket that would carry satellites into higher orbits from the space shuttle. The TDRS-B satellite, which stood for Tracking and Data Relay Satellite System and was commonly known as TDRS, was a space communications satellite meant to assist in NASA manned flights and increase the amount of data that could be transferred. The original satellite had experienced problems with the IUS and had not entered the correct orbit, so this was a second attempt at the goal.
I was working for the Air Force. I was a consultant. I was his technical advisor, and I had no management over contractors. I was like a Air Force officer without a uniform, but I spoke through the officer that I worked with, a major, and he gave me the, if I had a suggestion, I suggested to him that the contractor do this. I did not say, contractor do this. If he didn't do it, And I thought strongly enough, I would then tell its boss about it, who had his counterpart, and they would talk it over. And if they couldn't agree, we'd go up another step. And we could go all the way to the Secretary of the Air Force. So if the Air Force was supporting their personnel, and which they joined shoulders and do, it would go elevate all the way up. This could happen, and it did happen a few times. But the last person for the Air Force is a civilian, the Secretary of the Air Force. So he was honest enough to make an honest decision. So my position, being the civilian side, was I was like an officer, but I was not an officer. I was a consultant, technical consultant. We were all tired, but we expected no problems. It was we were all getting pretty used to launching shuttles. It was the 51st launch. It was beginning to be pretty much a normal thing. I was in a facility called the VAB, the Facility Assembly Building, where these were put together, these solid rockets, and moved out to the pad to be attached. So we had a room in that building that was protected by 1-inch thick lead all the way around. The doors, they had all sealed, the holes were sealed, everything. There could be no leakage of information, because there were Soviet satellites up beaming down trying to find some leaked information. There were ships out at the just out of the range in open water with their radars beamed towards us and their antennas beamed towards us. They were trying to find out, so that I was in that room. We used it to check out, to make sure this IUS was functional, that was inside the space shuttle. When my screen went blank and everything went quiet in the room, and the printers kept printing, and everyone was looking with their jaws dropped at each other and looking around trying to say, what has happened? Because after all, we were in that sealed, just like a sardine can. We were away from any explosion or any problem, which we stayed for about, I think, 14 hours after that, because the atmosphere outside was or could be dangerous, not healthy, and our vehicles that were parked outside in the parking lot, they turned white because of the acid in the air from the explosion affected the vehicle's coating of wax, and so when it was safe, the fire department came and hosed off all the vehicles because it could be washed off with a high pressure water.
The Rogers Commission, officially known as the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger, was created to investigate the disaster and determine its cause by observing the collected and reassembled remains of the ship. It included notable figures like Neil Armstrong, Sally Ride, and Richard Feynman.
It was caused by a failed O-ring in the booster solid rocket There's one on each side of the shuttle. The failure was in an O-ring around the segment of the rocket. There were various segments as was put together and sealed with this O-ring. It was very cold that day. It was close to freezing, if not 32. It could have been less there on the pad. That failure allowed the hot gases to escape and cause a detachment of the solid rocket from this external tank, which was full of hydrogen and oxygen, which was the fuel for the space shuttle. They ignited upon contact with each other. It did not require any match or any fire. Just touching each other, they would ignite. When this broke off, it ruptured this tank, and the two fuels instantly went together, and boom, there was a huge explosion, which was fatal for all of the astronauts and broke it up into many, many pieces. The rockets continued to burn, and the movies that we've seen and pictures of it, you can see them curling around and still fire coming out. It was put together and examined and placed in a I'm trying to say the word correctly, a Minuteman at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. The remains of the astronauts and the people on board that could be identified as being belonging to a certain person was given to the family for burial. Those parts that could not be identified is buried in a monument there. No, I believe the technology at that point was as good as we could possibly do. It was just a case of learning something. It's like asking the question, computers today. I work with computers with cards and paper tape with holes in them. Could we have done better if we would have had the solid memory that we have today and all of the information? Of course we could. Well, it was just that. We did the best we could with the knowledge we had at the time. But it was a growing technical and technology involved.
One of the results of the Challenger disaster was a 32-month hiatus during which time the Rogers Commission investigated the accident. It was here that the consequences of go fever were addressed. The desire to keep launching vehicles despite clear warning signs, such as a fatal flaw in the design of the SRBs that was known to scientists before the launch, had, at least in part, contributed to the disaster.
Well, I think it was excellent. The thing that I was used to really kind of get my goat was to see in the paper about the shuttle launch, but it was 22 minutes late. You know, we're looking at this experimental vehicle with thousands and thousands of things that must go right and the leading edge of technology. But we were getting so used to it that we got to complain about something. And the press did that. And so people started going as passengers, and that wasn't right. that didn't happen, like I said, for years afterwards. Not only the technical about improving the makeup of the O-ring, they still use O-rings, but definitely, and I think the temperature that they launch in will definitely was raised, and also the thought of it being like a bus and carrying civilians, being safe, being the 51st was, you know, we're getting used to it. It's a good thing. It had had accidents before, but not from the on this scale where there'd be that many people that were killed. But I guess the main thing was that having civilians and the teachers and the congressmen and people arrived just as passengers, that stopped. And you had to have the volunteer trained people who realized the dangers, who would take that danger involved.
The most notable crew member was the teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who performed the role of payload specialist. She was recruited as part of a NASA program to have a civilian, a teacher specifically, in space to boost public interest in the space program. And the attempt worked. 17% of Americans watched the takeoff live, and 85% knew of the disaster within an hour of its occurrence.
I'm very much against that, for now. Someday in Flash Gordon time, yes, but until it's a non-experimental thing, let's keep it scientific. I don't think I've had any feelings of that I did something, because I was at awe of the beauty of it. I think it's a beautiful scene to see the blue earth and even the clouds going up, even from the launch of the vehicles as the Earth got smaller as we went up. I just thought it was just very exciting and very entertaining, and it was a good feeling. I think it's very exciting that private industry is getting into the program now, and NASA is still involved, but it's becoming more competitive with the private industry wanting to put vehicles up, manned and unmanned. So.
Frank went on to contribute to various other NASA projects before retiring in 1993. He now lives with his wife Kim and their cat Spike.
Now, what else was it? Question?
No, I'm just.
You can cut that out.
Do you have more positions? Should I ask one of those, or is that it?
Let's have one more and then go on.
Do you want to talk about another position you had?
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't. I was.
An aerospace company.
Their checks didn't bounce. They also offered me a job which I couldn't refuse, and I tried to get my wife a job there, but they wouldn't do it. Said she didn't have an IQ, whatever that meant. Another question?
What was working with NASA like?
Terrible. So they were always had their minds up in the sky or somewhere. They were just not with it. They wouldn't come down to earth.
What was a normal day for the company like?
A normal day. They didn't have one. It was all abnormal. They kept waking us up. Every time we go to sleep, they'd wake us up. But their checks didn't bounce. And finally, they gave my wife a job. They made her the controller, and she lost her job and the checks didn't bounce. Did bounce. Okay. Also, there was a cat involved. The cat couldn't understand why people always wanted to pick it up.
Alright, Grisham. Next question.
You're only doing those three, I thought.
Now, there was one question that I would like to
Okay.
be very, very clear of. That what was the Cold War White House like? It was still white. It was still a house. And some very, very smart people sometime lived there. That's it.
Hey, good answer.
Oh, that was great!
Yay!
No kidding! What inspired you to work for an aerospace company?
Okay. My entry into the aerospace did not come overnight. It evolved. I was trained as a computer programmer, and I worked for a CPA, working business programs, when one of the largest companies called Univac, I was working with Univac Equipment, talked with me about coming to work for them. And I went up to Washington and interviewed and got a job, and they assigned me to a NASA program contract, working at Goddard Space Flight Center. So my entry was my way of just progression of my career. That's how I got my first introduction as a trainee scientific programmer. And then I became a programmer and eventually went up to program manager later on in the final part of my career.
What was working with NASA like?
Working with NASA was a very unique experience for me, coming from the mountains of Virginia, a town, Roanoke, Virginia, working business, going up to Washington, and all of a sudden I was working with very scientific people that were used to that way of life. And so I was fortunate though that most of the people I worked with came from all over the United States. So it was a conglomerate of people, and we learned from each other.
What was a normal day like?
A normal day was 24 hours. We worked different shifts. We had to man the computers because we were working in communications, and of course the time changes around the world. We were working at different shifts. So we would work the first shift during the day for a period of time, and then work the second, and then the dreaded midnight shift for a period of time. We took times, for instance, on Christmas Day, the single people worked that, and let us with families, we could be home with our family during that time.
What was your position or positions at the company?
Okay, I started off, as I said earlier, as a scientific programmer. I worked with a real-time programmer. I was one of the few in the world. We worked with NASA in developing real-time communications. At that time, what they would do, if you were in Spain and wanted to send a message to Hawaii, you would sit down at a teletype and type up a long tape with holes in it, and go over to the wall and feed it into the wall into a paper tape reader. And that would go through and read it and send that to usually Goddard Space Flight Center, where it would be printed out there with the holes in it. And they would look at it and it'd be printed on it, Hawaii. So they'd go over to the wall where Hawaii was and stick it in the wall, and it would show up in Hawaii with that tape. And then they would take that tape and put it in a machine, and the teletype would print it out. Well, that was a very time-consuming, but it was the best we had at the time. So what we did, we then took it and put a computer in there. So they teletyped into a computer. The computer sent it to Goddard Space Flight Center. The computer picked up Hawaii, sent it to Hawaii, and within seconds it was there. So that was and they did it real time in that there was no intervention of a man in there, and also we were handling hundreds at a time.
Do you want to talk about another position you had?
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't. Okay, so I went from that into communication. As you know, I was in communication. I got contacted by the Army, and I went to work for the Army in Hawaii. And I was stationed in Hawaii in a tunnel, working for automatic distribution of messages. So when that message I just spoke to previously came to Hawaii, it would be read, and if it was to General Andrews, they would go over to the wall where General Andrews has his name and feed it into it. So I worked on the system there. When it showed up in Hawaii, it showed up in a computer which recognized General and would send it directly to his office. So it even speeded it up and automated it even more. And from that, I came back. That job was over at the end of the year, and I came back and went to work for a company called Control Data Corporation. And I was still working as a contractor then. And the job entailed going to the Bahamas, and I took signatures of sound going through the water of different ships. And this was so the Navy could listen through their hydrophones to ships at sea, and without seeing or knowing them, from their signature of sound, know which ship it was. And that was very good, and I worked there for 2 years. It was my first introductory to Florida because my family stayed here in Florida, and I would come home every 2 weeks for a few days. And so I'd have my 4 days off every 2 weeks, and I'd come home, and well, it was 5 really, and we would have a 5-day vacation every 2 weeks. And from that, I got into working still with communications, with the Army, developing various field devices where the messages, if they went to out in a war zone, they could go out to, if it was to Colonel so-and-so, and he may be in a war zone fighting on the front line, it would still go to his office there in the field. And before, it would only go to the main offices that were in buildings and so forth. So we kind of expanded that quite a bit. And I came back and I got introduced into the Aerospace Corporation. And I spent close to about 20 years working within aerospace, working as a test and evaluation started off with computers again. The contractor who built the rockets would put them through their test, and if they passed, they would ship them to Cape Canaveral. When they arrived here at Cape Canaveral, we'd have to say, well, this has been shipped. How do we know it worked? You say it does. We would test it out, and then we would say to NASA or to the Army or the CIA or whoever it was, that yes, this is working, or no, it is not. And the contractor would have to come in and fix it, and then we'd have to test it again. So that was tests and evaluation. I eventually moved up to program project manager, which was, I had a officer in the Air Force, and I worked together. He would be the total manager of it, and I was his shoulder. I was at his shoulder at all times. He under orders, whenever he signed his name, he had to have approval from me that I approved of whatever he was signing. And I would sign my name with an A with a circle around it, Aerospace Corporation. They call this a Circle A branch. So what that meant was that we backed him up. And we were a very large, very influential, and also very intellectual group in Los Angeles. So I was at that, my final years, where I worked with him and I was the program manager. I worked in California for a while with the Air Force, where we were building a space shuttle launch platform, just like they have at Cape Canaveral today, or did have. That was so the Air Force could launch their own shuttle. They didn't want to fool with NASA. We want to do it ourselves. So we were going to launch we called it our blue satellites for the Air Force. And we went out there and we built one. But it never materialized because of software problems and cooperation between the two agencies, between the Air Force and NASA, just didn't work out. So it was never used, but it was it was just like it was here, but it was never materialized. So I spent all the way from scientific programmer all the way up to a project program manager. And that was it.
What was the project that you were most proud of?
I think that early on in my career, I worked in the Apollo program. The Apollo program was to put a man on the moon. And we had to beat the Russians. It was competitive. We were in competition. It was not a game, but it was a game. We were actually had to beat the Russians, and we did. And they gave up. We took over the control of space as far as man was concerned. So that was, I think, the most rewarding part of my career, was being part of the winning team with the Apollo program. Putting a man in the shuttle and returning him, that was fun, but putting a man on the moon, that was something.
What was the Cold War White House like?
The Cold War White House had been going on for many years when I was there. I spent 99% of the time at the White House that you folks don't know about. It's in Maryland. It's in a mountain. The White House is there. The all the congressmen have their offices there. All of the dignitaries that we need in case there was an attack on Washington could go to, that was bomb-proof, atomic bomb-proof, and still our country could go. So we had to duplicate not only the White House, but Congress. And I don't know if, I know the tunnel that leads into it, and probably that hollowed out mountain is still there, but I don't know what it's being used for today when I left it and I never heard anything more about it. So it was classified.
How did the Space Shuttle program contribute to the Cold War?
It was a vehicle to put, I would think, the biggest contribution would be the vehicle that put what we call spy satellites up in the sky, where they could assist the armed forces and the CIA for information and collecting data on our enemies. It was very important because when the Russians found out that we knew things, they were very surprised. Just as we were when they found out that they knew things that we didn't know they knew. But we knew more, and we won the war. So it was not meant to be a weapon, but that was, we used it, we being the military, but we also developed our larger rockets, the Titan, which is now called Atlas V and still in use. They could put up larger satellites than the shuttle could, because the shuttle carried people. And with people you had to have safety. You had to have extra things like oxygen and escape equipment and weight. And that weight took away from the weight that you could put up in space. But if you have a non-manned solid rocket, or no, that could be liquid, but an unmanned go up, it was stripped down for weight, and you could put much heavier items up, much larger and more scientific satellites.
What was the general mood at every launch?
I'm not being facetious, but we were tired. The effort that goes into a launch of putting it up in the air goes on for days ahead of time. And the hours that you put in testing and retesting and getting all those.
What did you feel was the hardest transition between your jobs?
The hardest transition between jobs? Was that it? Okay. I have to say my first one. The hardest transition was going from a business world, working with CPAs and professional people, into the scientific world up in Washington, D.C. That was very difficult. It was one that was challenging and rewarding, but at the time I didn't realize how it was. The other progressions I made were in natural order. I progressed up from that scientific programmer to systems analyst, to senior systems analyst, and so forth, all the way up to management. So I never skipped up a step. So it was an organized progression.
What is the difference between the Space Shuttle program and other NASA programs?
Okay.
Which projects did you work
Yeah,
on?
the Space Shuttle was one of testing and then launch. That was the, I said this, I don't know, I meant to say that was the Apollo. We tested. The shuttle had a lot of design where the engineering successful test was the final test. We didn't go and actually put up, as we did in the Apollo program, rockets without anybody in it, or a monkey in it, or something like that. the shuttle was, we went straight to launch. And you hope that your design and your tests of the design was correct, and it happened to have a failure in it, which we all know in the Challenger program, our Challenger vehicle 91. Oh, launch 9, not vehicle, launch 91. Okay.
What was the Challenger project?
The Challenger project was to put a shuttle we called it TDRS, TDRS, into orbit so that space shuttles, whichever one would be up, could communicate with 23 other space shuttles, or you might say offices or agencies, or 23 others. And it would be a satellite that would assist the future space shuttles to communicate better with the Earth and with its support. And that was TDRS. There were some minor or less major things. For instance, there was a teacher on board. What was it, McAfee? I always had trouble pronouncing that, but she actually was going to do an experiment up there, and there were high schools all over the U.S. that were doing this experiment along with her. So it was a very educational thing. She was not an astronaut. There were other minor experiments, but that was the major reason for it to go.
Right. Let's take our 5-minute break now.